This week, we're talking more about the environment in which requirements are created. Um, Requirements aren't something that happen one time and you sit down, you have some meetings, you knock them out, you write them, and then you're good to go. You're finished. Yay. No, the requirements is definitely something that evolves over time. And that has certain ramifications if you think about it. Because if I tell you, go get me a pizza, and you're driving to the pizza place and I change my mind part of the way there, then you might be driving the exact opposite direction to go get me, a cheeseburger. So the changes to requirements and how they change can have dramatic effects. Now, mind you, they could also have positive effects. I could say, go get me a pizza on the moon and say, yeah, you know what, down the street's just fine. I could make your job a lot simpler. It's not that every requirement changes makes everything harder. And so what we need to do within requirements is talk about the process in which it lives. And so when we talk about a process in software development, what we're talking about is a formal set of steps that might be informally captured. We generally, when we talk about a process, it needs to be something that's repeatable. That's the whole point of a process. So you can't just say everybody's following a process. Well, technically, everybody's doing something towards software development. But the process is saying, if I did this project again, I would generally do these similar steps again. I might have different results. It might take different durations and things like that, but I would do things like capture requirements. And some of the stuff we designed up front, we would have captured. Am I going to do interviews? Am I going to have JAD sessions? Those are elements that might be included formally in the process. Some companies require you to do certain things every single time, others allow you to change it. That process is called tailoring. But the process defines generally how we get from the start of the project to the end of the project. And so why do we bother with it? It's people do this type of stuff every day. Do we need this much red tape slowing us down, extra documentation to follow, every extra box to check? Well, generally speaking, following a process does take some overhead. It might translate to more time. It might translate to more people in the project. It might just translate to a little bit of inefficiency. Where you waste a little bit of time each day doing certain checks. But on top of that, the question is can I be as flexible with the process? If you're defining the steps I take, well, what if I could have come up with a better step outside of it? Well, it's true. All these things are true. They're all valid concerns to a varying degree. Some projects more, some projects less. But if we're going to accept the slowdown, we need a positive net result. If we're putting some limitations on what we're going to come up with in the solution, then what is worth the extra problem? Well, the idea of the process is I'm trying to get a minimum outcome. So if you think of it this way, if you have a lottery ticket out there and you buy a lottery ticket for $1, you're risking that dollar. You might lose $1, you might win some dollars. You can take the same lottery ticket and have it be $100 lottery ticket. And so I can win a lot more money, like maybe 100,000 times more money. If I take the same thing and I put $1 million lottery ticket out there, again, I could win nothing, I could win a whole lot of money. The bigger the stakes, the less acceptable that risk. If I lose $1, If I lose $100, that's worth the risk. But as I get bigger and bigger, I'm not willing to accept that risk. So what I want to do is ensure that instead of buying a lottery ticket, I'll go get something like a stock. So I guess technically speaking, anything, good stock could go down to zero. The price could go down to zero. Any project, even following a process, could completely bomb if people don't do a good job, something unexpected come up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put checks and balances in place. If you buy a stock, you have the the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission's checking stuff out. You have transparency of reporting. You know what the company's doing year by year. You don't know everything about the company, but you have a good feel. You let the company run itself, but you get to check into the numbers that are in there from time to time. That's what process does. It lets us get those numbers. I mean, a company doesn't want to do reporting documents per se, they'd rather be making money. But it's the cost of doing business to ensure that there's somebody who can put some checks and balances. The whole point of process is to try and get a minimum level of quality and productivity and reliability and shared knowledge out of it, as opposed to just relying on experts to do a great job, which they might do. Might do better than if I didn't follow the process. But it's a hedging the bet, if you will. So there's a framework in which we can talk about process, and this framework applies depending on no matter what the level of it is. So in one case, some projects might have the whole class here requirements be just one step of the process, but you can also have a process defined within just requirements, depending on what company you're in and how detailed you are. So generally speaking, we have a definition phase, which is what we're talking about now, what we're trying to build, the requirements phase. You go into a development phase, which tells us a little bit how do we want to build this thing. And then eventually you get into a maintenance phase where, okay, it's been built, let's fix it, let's keep it up running, let's make progressive enhancements, things like that. And what's important here is there's not necessarily this clear phase that we only do requirements definition phase. We might do some requirements development all the way through this. So don't think that we always live in this first box here. During the development, we would say, you know what? We're missing something here. Let's go write a requirement to capture that. Or in the maintenance phase, just like, you know what? It'd be great to add this thing. Let's go write a requirement to capture what we want to write. So defining the process has three specific elements we're going to look at: activities, methods, and artifacts. The activities are the high-level things you want to get done. The methods is how do you do that thing, and the artifact is what's the result of that at a high level. We'll look at this more here in a second. But it's important to understand this terminology within process, because knowing which one's which helps you frame what you're looking at. You see a list of activities together, you can say, oh, this is the things that are happening, but I didn't necessarily tell me how I do them. So, this class, I say I'm going to do requirements. Well, how are you going to do that? I'm going to do elicitation, and then I'm going to do documentation, and then I'm going to do some validation. Okay, well, how are you going to do that? That was what phase one was about, is how are you going to elicit requirements? So we gave you kind of the activities, and you gave me a view of your methods when you got to that step. You came back and said, oh, how I'm going to do that step is I'm going to conduct interviews. I'm going to do a JAD session and whatever you're going to do inside of there. And then the results of that was going to be some notes, and then the results of the next phase was use cases or shall requirements or the other things we talked about. That's the artifacts that came up with that. So again, the activities, that top level. Examples of this. Your project management has multiple activities that's going on. Doing scheduling, doing status meetings and reports and things like that. Your requirements capture, design, implementation, formal testing. These are high-level ones of the whole project. But as we said, you can have activities even within requirements capture that you might have. You might have multiple steps. In your coding, you probably have multiple steps. You might have different pieces that you're putting together. You build code, you unit test code, you do things along those lines. And then those are further described by using this timeline. So the activities typically come in some sort of order that comes along. There's development activities, development of the activities, which show you big chunks of the project being done, and then you have overview activities. So you can see requirements, design, code, test. There might be some overlap within those things, but then the overview activities go through the whole project. That's your project management type stuff typically. So the individual activities here aren't implying necessarily they always have an order. They might have an order, but we can order these activities in multiple ways. You've probably heard, and there's other classes that talk more about process, things like the waterfall methodology, where I write all my requirements, I do all my design, I do all my code, I do all my test. But then there's iterative processes where I do a little bit of each of these. There's agile processes. There's all sorts of processes. And the point being here, these can be ordered and run in many different ways. We want to distinguish the fact of what's going on versus how we're doing it. So, you write a song and you write a poem, say an instrumental song. You could play them separately, or you could play them together. So you read your poem, you record the text only. You write a song, you play the music. So I could have you listen to the song, then listen to the poem. Or I could start reading the poem, then the song comes in. Or I could start playing the song, and then the poem comes in. Or I can play them both at the same time. That doesn't matter. They're both pieces of work. So similarly, I can start my requirements, and I'm probably not going to design the requirement I'm currently working on, but I can finish part of the requirements and let somebody go off and start designing those while I continue to work on the requirements. But that becomes an interesting question of how do they change? That's what we're going to come back to here in a second. So the overview activities then are the things that, as we said, are keeping track of each of the other ones. So I've looked at the schedule. You said it's going to take you 6 weeks to do requirements, and you'll have 50 pages of requirements. And so now we're 4 weeks in, and you have 4 pages of requirements. Are you going to be able to get all that requirements work done in the last 2 weeks? It's like, oh yeah, that's exactly how we have it planned. We just had to ask questions, and now I can write it all down. Or, wow, no way, we're not going to get that done. We're going to need some extra time. And again, it's not about being wrong, it's about monitoring it, knowing and planning accordingly, and letting people know. And that's what these other activities are. They're looking for risks and changes and being aware, so that way you can, again, keep your process effective and moving forward. So past that, you have the methods, which is basically those steps and details of how that gets done. And so that can be high level, like I'm going to do estimation and scheduling. This is how you write a requirements document, or how you do detailed design, or how you do unit tests. Typically, there's going to be some sort of template involved here that tells you what the type of thing you're going to build is, and there's going to be some instructions, maybe some standards by which you do this. Not every project documents its methods. It could be very tribal knowledge that this is just the way you do it, but I've seen processes that tell you exactly step by step, this is what you're going to do and this is how you do it. It just depends on how much your organization chooses to invest in its process and how much they care about exact steps. And the more mission critical the software, the more likely your process is going to be very detailed. The more you just hire and good people and trust them to do good work, the less methods you might have, to the point you might have none actually documented, or just random standards and stuff. But the idea of the methods, they fit within each of those boxes. So within the requirements, I find requirements and I document the requirements. Then with design, I do preliminary design, then detailed design. The idea is these show you high-level tasks. Again, these could be considered activities within the activities, but they become methods when they have very specific guides and documentations of how to do this. This is where you capture it, this is what you ask, and things like that. And I know it's a method because it tells me how to generate an artifact. The artifact is the record of what the work you have completed is. It doesn't necessarily have to be a document. It could be, certainly source code is a document, but it's also an executable that happens. It could be imagery. I've created screenshots, or mock-up screenshots. Could be digital assets along those lines. It could be recording of a meeting or something like that. You could do a document of meeting notes, or you could just throw the audio recording up there if you wanted to. There's a lot of flexibility in what an artifact is. But examples, you have the schedule, the specification, the design document. All those things are the types of things we would build. So given this framework, we want to talk about how that impacts design requirements. Because as we said, if I have these activities that are iterative, how do I keep track of what requirements are changing? How do I keep track of how the project changes in accordance to those requirements changes? And that's what we want to get to within this section, is how do we deal with these processes and how do they impact the way I work on requirements?